The last hour. The sky above the Pacific seemed calm to the people who did not understand the new colors moving across the clouds. Thin waves of light bent and shifted like northern auroras. But Mara knew they were not natural. Those colors meant the Archons were close. She stood on the balcony of the United Terran Network Tower and watched the sky with eyes that felt heavy from weeks without real rest. The tower vibrated under her feet with the steady hum of shield generators waking up, each pulse deep like a heartbeat. Below in the street, citizens walked quietly toward the shelters. They carried children, carried bags of food, carried small things that still gave them comfort. No one shouted and no one cried out loud because in the last month everyone had learned silence was safer, as if the enemy could hear noise through the air itself. Commander Rourke stepped beside her and set a dented metal flask on the railing. His hands were scarred with old burns, reminders of battles against fires and weapons that had carved through cities. He did not offer her the flask, and she did not ask for it because they both knew there was no time for comfort. His voice was steady when he gave her the latest reports from orbital patrols. The Archon vanguard was less than 3 hours away, if it kept the current pace. The moons had gone dark already. Relay stations near Neptune had not screamed for help, or sent final warnings. They had simply vanished, like candles blown out in a room too big to see. The Archons did not fight with guns or engines. They pressed thought against matter until matter forgot how to be solid. In the war room beneath them, a circle of light flickered with the faces of world leaders. Some faces were sharp, others blurred from broken links, others blurred because people still loved secrets even in the shadow of extinction. An old counselor read aloud from the protocol ledger, the book of final measures written for times when survival seemed impossible. The list was short. Most of the measures had been tried already. Only one remained sealed, a thin line at the bottom, hidden for centuries, marked with a name that few dared to speak. The room grew quiet when eyes settled on it. The ministers argued in low voices. A leader from the Belt Colonies said using that protocol was madness. A scientist from Lagos said it was worse than madness because it was hope tied to a blade that cut both ways. Rourke finally said the words that no one wanted to hear. The hour had come to break the seal. Mara said nothing because she knew her voice might tremble, and she did not want them to see her as young or weak. She was 26, trained in diplomacy, trusted to speak with alien cartels and trade houses, but this was not a contract to negotiate. This was something heavier. When the seal was opened, a hidden file showed the map of the tower's depths. Beneath storage vaults and transit veins lay a chamber forgotten in official records, disguised as a water regulator. The real description called it a shrine to pragmatism. The box that held the key was passed forward by trembling hands. It was small, plain, and warm to the touch. Inside lay a thin white shard, curved like part of a flute. It was not alien, yet it was not quite human. It was human enough to answer when called. Rourke carried the shard with care as they descended through the private lift. The air grew cooler and carried the smell of old stone and machine oil. Lights blinked alive one after another, stretching into the darkness like stars along a narrow path. The chamber was built from plates of metal that refused to shine. In the center stood a pedestal surrounded by markings too sharp to be letters. The socket at the top matched the shard exactly. Mara held her breath as Rourke placed it into place. For a moment it seemed nothing would happen, but then she felt a whisper against her skin like hair brushing the back of her neck. She read the code phrase as it was written. It was a simple line of words, but it felt heavy on her tongue. It named the caller as kin, and the target as debt. Her throat burned, as if she had swallowed ice. The ground beneath them trembled, not from a weapon but from something greater. It felt as if a million eyes had turned toward Earth all at once. Far above, the Archon fleet slowed. It was a small change, but it was real. They had felt the call and hesitated. In the streets of cities, around the world, people looked up, sensing a shift without knowing why. Some cried without reason. Some prayed. In the war room, the council sat in silence. In the far edge of the system, past Pluto, a patch of darkness grew darker. It was not a hole. It was a fleet with no lights and no banners. It moved without, Sound because it had never needed to announce itself. The one species that even the gods feared had heard the call and was coming home. The signal that should never be sent. The chamber's silence lingered long after the shard cracked. Mara stood. In the heavy air, her heart beating as if it wanted to escape her chest. Rourke's face was still and unreadable, though she saw his jaw tighten. Above them, the auroras stretched wider, filling the heavens with patterns too perfect to be natural. The Archons were aware. The call had been felt not only by the exiles but by the enemy pressing closer with every breath of time. She knew what that meant. They had not only lit a beacon, they had struck a bell that rang across the void, a sound so sharp that every predator in the dark would turn its head toward Earth. When they returned to the war room, the council was waiting. The old minister who had warned against this course stood trembling with anger, demanding to know if the call had been answered. Rourke gave a short nod, and the room fell silent. Even those who hated the idea most felt the weight of his confirmation. Mara explained what she had heard in the voice that answered. It was human, but not human in the way they knew. It had carried the sound of stone cracking under frost, iron bending under too much weight, and yet it had called them kin. She told them that the fleet promised to arrive before the Archons reached Mars, and that the price would be given after the second sunrise. The words left her lips like lead. The ministers demanded to know the cost, but Mara could only say what she had been told. They would not name it yet. The price of survival was always named at the moment when refusal was no longer possible. The debate became fierce. Some said Earth should prepare to surrender before the Archons rather than trust the exiles. Others shouted that surrender was death and that no enemy would spare them. Rourke finally raised his voice and reminded them that survival had never been cheap for humanity. Every generation had paid in blood, in toil, in the burning of old worlds and the building of new ones. He said that refusing to call for help would only make their deaths slower. The council did not agree, but they did not overturn the act. The call was made, and no words could pull it back. Later, Mara walked the lower corridors alone, needing space to think. The walls carried the vibration of distant engines as ships launched into defensive positions. Her footsteps echoed like she was walking inside the ribcage of a giant. She reached the observation dome and looked out at the dark beyond the sky. Stars shone clear, each one a needle of light, but between them something else moved. A shape, without running lights, without the glow of engines, drifted across the void. It was not yet close enough to see detail, but her body told her before her mind could reason. The exiles had answered. In that moment, she remembered the lessons she had read in forbidden texts. Long ago, when humanity had still struggled to climb among the stars, there had been a fracture. A branch of their own species had taken a different path, surviving on worlds where nothing should have lived, adapting in ways that were not entirely natural. They had vanished from the records, erased by choice or by exile, but their memory lingered as warnings whispered in myths. It was said that the Archons themselves avoided those systems, that even gods turned away when exile ships appeared. Now Mara felt the truth in her bones. Humanity had not called strangers. They had called cousins who had been sharpened by the cruelty of forgotten sons. Rourke found her there in the dome. His face looked carved from stone, but his eyes followed the same shape moving against the stars. He told her that once, long ago, he had served on an outpost near the ruins of a dead ice world. On that wall had been the mark of a hand, burned deep into the stone, not painted or carved, but seared as if the flesh that touched it had carried a star's heat. He had not spoken of it to anyone because it sounded like madness, but now, watching the shape of the fleet grow larger, he believed the stories. As the hours passed, fear spread across the planet in quiet ways. Families pressed closer in the shelters. Pilots strapped themselves into cockpits with steady hands that still trembled when no one was watching. Priests of dozens of faiths filled temples with voices raised in prayer, though some prayers asked not for victory but for mercy from what was coming to help them. Everyone could feel that survival was now chained to something darker than hope. Above, the world, the Archons continued their approach. Their fleets were like rivers of liquid light, shimmering and shifting, rewriting the space around them. Yet their rhythm had changed. They were no longer rushing forward without thought. They had slowed, testing, watching. For the first time since the war began, they moved with hesitation. Even gods could be afraid. Mara pressed her hand against the glass of the dome as she felt the first signal from the approaching fleet. It was not a broadcast of words or images. It was a pulse that sank into her skin like a second heartbeat. It carried no message, but it carried meaning. We are here. We are coming. The world below would never be the same after their arrival. But for the first time since the sky had turned against them, Mara felt the smallest spark of belief. Humanity was no longer standing alone. The return of the exiles, the dawn over Earth, came pale and cold, but the light could not hide the new shadows in the sky. Ships without signals and without banners had entered the system. They did not announce themselves with transmissions of greeting or identification codes. They moved with silence, sliding through space like hunters that had no need to prove what they were. Civilian eyes turned upward from cities and colonies, searching for hope but finding unease instead, because these vessels did not resemble any human design they knew. Their hulls were jagged like broken stone, layered with armor that seemed grown instead of built, and their silhouettes bent light so that even telescopes struggled to follow their exact shape. Mara stood in the command dome beside Commander Rourke and felt her chest tighten. The fleet was vast, but it was not only the number that chilled her. It was the way they moved together, not like a navy but like a pack of wolves circling prey. Every ship kept perfect distance, as if bound by instinct, rather than orders. The council argued over open channels, voices rising in panic. Some demanded that the exiles be hailed at once. Others warned that speaking to them before knowing their demands would be dangerous. Rourke silenced them all with a single command. He had served in wars long enough to know that predators respected strength, not chaos. The first transmission from the exiles came without warning. It was not a sound across the air, but a presence inside the minds of every officer linked to the network. A figure appeared in the dome's holographic field. The image was tall, armored, and unmistakably human. Though changed by long centuries in hostile places, the armor was black and etched with scars that glowed faintly, as if carrying the memory of battles long past. His face was calm, stern, and marked by lines of silver that traced his skin like rivers of frost. His eyes glowed with a pale fire, not mechanical but something older, something carved by the cruelty of survival. "I am the Primarch of the Exiles," the voice said, steady and measured. "We heard the debt called and we have answered. You stand at the edge of erasure. We will stand beside you, but you will understand the price when the sun has risen twice over your world." The council demanded to know what price, but the Primarch did not answer. He only looked at them as one might look at children who did not understand the weight of war. Then the image faded, and the dome was filled again with the cold light of the stars. Mara felt her knees weaken. The voice had not been cruel. It had not been kind either. It had been certain, and certainty was heavier than threats. The exile fleet spread across the system with speed that shocked the defense analysts. They did not hesitate to enter zones long forbidden by Terran law. They took positions near the asteroid belts, near the orbital platforms, even close to the moon itself. They did not request permission. They acted as if Earth was already part of them, as if the centuries of separation had been no more than a pause in a long conversation. Civilian broadcasts filled with fear. Some cheered the arrival of saviors. Others whispered that monsters had returned to claim what had been lost. Rourke gathered the officers in the war room and told them to watch carefully. The Archons had paused beyond Mars, their shimmering rivers of light flowing with slower rhythm now. For the first time in all their campaigns across the galaxy, they hesitated. That hesitation was proof enough of what the exiles represented. Whatever they had become in exile, they were the one force the Archons did not rush to destroy. Mara could not shake the image of the Primarch. She wondered what his people had endured to carve that kind of calm into their bones. She had studied 100 cultures, learned how belief shaped action. But this was different. The exiles carried no banner of faith, no claim to divine favor. They carried themselves as if they needed nothing beyond their own survival. And it was that independence that seemed to terrify the Archons, beings who had ruled countless worlds by making themselves gods to weaker species. The exiles would never kneel. As night fell again across Earth, a single exile vessel entered low orbit. It was larger than any Terran dreadnought, its surface lined with scars that glowed faint red as if the ship itself breathed. From its hull extended spires like the bones of some vast creature. It cast a shadow across the oceans that stirred fear in all who looked up. Yet no weapon fire came, no invasion began. The ship simply hovered, watching, waiting, claiming its place above humanity's home without speaking. Mara stood with Rourke at the shoreline of the Pacific Command Base and felt the waves beat against the sand as the ship eclipsed the moonlight. She asked him if they had done the right thing. He did not answer right away. Finally, he said that sometimes right and wrong did not matter, only survival. She thought about the Primarch's eyes, about the way the Archons had slowed their advance, and she knew he was right. The return of the exiles was not rescue. It was not salvation. It was the arrival of family long forgotten, family changed by harsh stars, family who carried the promise of survival and the threat of domination in the same hand. Earth had called, and they had come. Now, the true cost would be revealed in the days to follow. What terrifies the gods? The Archons had paused their advance, their fleets of shifting light holding position just beyond Mars. To many on Earth, this pause looked like mercy, but Mara and Rourke understood. It was not kindness. It was hesitation born of fear, and the reason for that fear was already clear. The exiles did not waste time with ceremony. Their fleet moved like a predator scenting blood. They swept past orbital lines, cutting into zones of space where Terran law once held firm. They established formations not of defense but of entrapment, encircling the Archons with precision that defied ordinary tactics. Mara was summoned to observe a demonstration that the Primarch himself had ordered. She followed Rourke to a remote command vessel where the air was heavy with tension. Through the viewing windows, she saw one of the Archon advanced tendrils, a cluster of ships that shimmered like rivers of liquid fire. These ships had destroyed moons with ease, had unmade entire continents by pressing their will into the matter of worlds. Yet when the exiles targeted them, the impossible became real. The exile vessel chosen for the strike was small compared to the Archon cluster, no larger than a Terran cruiser. It did not fire missiles or beams of energy. Instead, it unfolded its hull, revealing machinery that looked alive. The metal bent and twisted until it resembled a vast jaw lined with blades of glowing matter. Then it lunged, not through space, in the way known to physics, but as if it cut a hole between 2 points and stepped through. One moment the ship floated beside its fleet, the next it was among the Archons. There was no explosion in the traditional sense. The Archon ships simply folded in on themselves, collapsing into silence as if their own existence had been denied. Gasps filled the command deck. Mara pressed a hand to her chest, her breath sharp and shallow. She had studied weapons all her life, but nothing in her knowledge could describe what she had just seen. Rourke leaned forward, his scarred face lit by the glow of the dying enemy, and muttered that this was why gods feared wolves. The exile ship reformed, closing its jagged hull like a beast licking blood from its teeth, then rejoined the formation without celebration. There was no cheer from their fleet. To them, this was routine, not triumph. Later, Mara was granted audience with the Primarch, though audience felt like the wrong word. He stood at the center of his chamber, a place of steel and shadow, with no throne and no guards. His presence was enough. She asked him what the Archons were to him and his people. He answered without hesitation. They are nothing more than tyrants who grew fat on fear. When we refused to kneel, they learned that fear can be broken. She asked how his fleet fought with weapons that ignored the laws of matter. He told her that laws were written by those too weak to break them. His eyes glowed pale as he spoke, and she felt the chill of those words sink into her bones. The Terran Council erupted in arguments when reports of the demonstration reached them. Some demanded that humanity distance itself from the exiles before. The price of alliance grew unbearable. Others insisted that survival mattered more than dignity, that the Archons could not be resisted without these terrifying cousins. Mara listened but said nothing. She kept seeing the Archon fleet collapse in silence, kept hearing the calm voice of the Primarch, and knew that there was no path back to the world they had known. As the second night fell, exile ships began to show more of their power. They released drones shaped like shards of obsidian that moved in clouds, each one smaller than a man, yet faster than light itself in their bursts. These swarms tore through Archon probes with merciless efficiency, carving thoughts from machines, erasing commands before they could spread. The Archons tried to press their will against the exile formations, bending space and time as they had done against every other enemy. But this time their power faltered. The exile ships bent back, twisting the pressure into knots that turned against the Archons themselves. Mara felt the truth settling on her shoulders. The gods were not gods at all. They were creatures of power and arrogance, built on the worship of the weak. The exiles terrified them not because of strength alone, but because of defiance. They could not be made to kneel. They carried the memory of centuries of exile, the scars of survival on hostile worlds, and the knowledge that no tyrant could break them again. In the quiet after the battle, Mara stood at the edge of the viewing platform and looked down at Earth. The oceans gleamed silver in the moonlight, the continents dark but alive with hidden lights. For the first time in months, the planet seemed untouchable. Yet she could not shake the thought that the Archons were not the only beings to fear. The exiles had shown their hand, and in that hand was the power to unmake gods. If they chose, that same hand could close around Earth itself. She whispered to herself that survival always came with a price, and the sun had not yet risen twice. The price of calling them, the exiles had shown why even gods hesitated, but power was never free. Mara knew this when she heard the Primarch's summons. He did not request politely. He simply announced that a delegation from Earth would meet him aboard his flagship before the second sunrise. The council had no choice. They argued for hours, each minister shouting about danger, betrayal, or opportunity. Yet every voice ended in silence because they all understood the same truth. The call had been made and debts must be faced. Rourke and Mara were chosen to attend. They boarded a transport with a handful of escorts, rising from the surface into the shadow of the massive exile vessel. Its hull loomed like a mountain of black stone, marked with glowing scars that pulsed faintly as if the ship breathed. No signal lights blinked, no welcoming corridors extended. Their small ship was swallowed into a hangar where the walls curved like the ribs of a beast. The air shimmered with faint heat. Soldiers in armor that looked grown instead of forged waited for them. Their faces were human yet sharpened, their eyes pale and steady, their movements too precise to be mistaken for ordinary men and women. The Primarch awaited them in a chamber that felt more like a cathedral than a command deck. The walls were etched with marks that seemed carved by fire, and above hung banners made from the hides of creatures Mara did not recognize. The Primarch stood tall, his armor black and silver, his presence heavier than gravity. He did not waste time. He told them that the exiles would fight beside Earth against the Archons. He told them victory was certain if they stood together. Then he named the price. The first demand was access to the deepest archives of Earth, the vaults hidden beneath mountains and oceans, places where old knowledge was sealed away. The second demand was not a thing but a pledge. Humanity would join the exiles in a greater war, one not against the Archons alone, but against powers beyond. Them powers the galaxy had not yet seen. The Council had prayed for protection without cost. But here the cost was laid bare. Alliance meant debt. Debt meant binding themselves to a future of blood. Mara's breath caught as she listened. She saw Rourke's jaw clench, but he did not speak yet. She asked the Primarch why they needed the archives. He answered with a calm voice. Within Earth's forgotten records were fragments of the path that led to the exile of his people. Those fragments were keys to weapons and truths that must be restored. She asked what this greater war was. He told her that the Archons were only the beginning, a symptom of a galaxy where tyrants claimed the throne of gods. He said the exiles meant to end it, and humanity would either join or perish later when the storm spread. When the message was relayed to Earth, the council exploded. With fury, some screamed that the exiles were conquerors wearing the mask of kin. Others begged to accept, pointing to the Archon fleets pressing closer with every passing hour. Civilian broadcasts filled with panic. People asked why humanity must always pay for survival with chains. Others shouted that freedom meant nothing if death arrived first. The world trembled on the edge of choice. That night the Archons struck with rage. Their hesitation ended. They unleashed a storm across the outer defenses, waves of energy that bent planet-side skies into blinding fire. Orbital platforms crumbled. Colonies across the belt screamed for aid. The exiles responded instantly. Their ships leapt into battle, jaws of metal tearing into rivers of light. They pushed back the storm with brutal efficiency, but Earth still felt the impact. Cities shook under the strain. Mara watched from the dome as flames streaked the heavens, and she understood what the Primarch had meant. They could not wait. Rourke stood before the council after the attack. His voice was hard and steady. He told them survival demanded choice. They could cling to pride and die, or they could bind themselves to cousins forged in exile and live to fight another day. He reminded them that humanity had always paid prices for survival. Every generation had built on the sacrifices of the last. This would be no different. Mara felt his words carve through the room like a blade. Slowly, grudgingly, the council bent. Not all agreed, but enough did. The pledge would be given. The archives would be opened. Mara walked out of the chamber into the cold night and looked up at the stars. They burned bright, sharp against the black, but in her eyes they looked less like hope and more like sparks from a fire that could spread across the galaxy. The price was named and accepted. Now Earth would stand with the exiles not just against the Archons, but against whatever storm awaited beyond. The battle for the sun. The Archons came with fury once the pledge was spoken. Their fleets no longer lingered beyond Mars, but surged forward like rivers of burning light. They did not aim for Earth directly at first. Instead, they struck at the heart of the system itself, bending their power toward the sun. The Archons sought to unmake the star, to unravel the bonds that held its fire, and by doing so to kill not only Earth, but every world in the cradle of Sol. The skies of the inner planets lit with unnatural storms as their energy poured inward. The exiles did not wait. They moved with a swiftness that stunned even the hardened Terran admirals. Ships formed a ring of iron around the sun, a chain of dark silhouettes interlocked with patterns that seemed alive. Terran fleets joined them, dreadnoughts and cruisers, falling into place beside jagged exile vessels. For the first time in history, two branches of humanity fought side by side, one born in the cradle of Earth, the other forged in exile among hostile stars. Mara rode aboard the Primarch's flagship, her eyes fixed on the burning light at the center of the system as the battle began. The Archons pressed their will upon the sun, twisting its core, sending waves of radiation through space like tides of death. Terran shields strained and groaned, sparks flying across decks as reactors pushed past limits. The exiles countered with weapons that bent space itself, anchoring the sun's fury with chains of invisible force. They did not defend, with gentle science but with brutal engineering, tearing holes in the fabric of space to bleed off the pressure. Mara felt the deck beneath her shudder as if the ship itself were alive, resisting not only weapons but the will of gods. Commander Rourke held the Terran line near Earth. His fleet stood like a wall between home and destruction. Enemy fire poured down, cutting through orbital stations and scattering debris across the atmosphere. But Rourke's voice on the command channels never wavered. He ordered counterstrikes with precision, weaving Terran squadrons into the exile formations. At times it seemed as if they would break, but every time they held, their ships answering one another like voices in a single song. The Primarch turned to Mara during the chaos. He told her the time had come to strike deeper. He revealed a weapon, hidden in the flagship's core, a device that pulsed with dark light, not of destruction alone, but of erasure. It was meant to cut into the heart of the Archon fleet, not to scatter ships, but to silence the thought that bound them. To deliver it required carrying the device into the storm of the enemy's will. He asked Mara to ride with him, not as soldier, but as witness, so that Earth would know the truth of what had been done. Fear gripped her, but she agreed. Together they entered the assault craft that held the device. Around them, exile warriors prepared for battle, their armor gleaming with scars. The craft launched from the flagship and plunged into the storm. Archon ships shimmered ahead, walls of liquid light pressing inward, waves of impossible energy lashing across space. The craft shook violently, metal screaming as currents of raw thought tried to tear it apart. Mara clung to her harness, her breath ragged, but the Primarch stood unmoving, his eyes fixed forward, as if no force in the universe could bend him. Back near Earth, Rourke gave orders through fire and smoke. His ships were battered, shields, flickering hulls cracked, but they did not fall. He guided them with a steady hand, weaving Terran courage with exile precision. When an enemy wave surged too close, he led the counterattack himself, his flagship's cannons blazing against rivers of light until they fractured and dissolved. Every time his crew looked at him, they found resolve instead of fear. And so, they fought on. The assault craft pierced deeper into the Archon formation. Mara felt her mind shake as whispers pressed against her skull. Voices of gods promising surrender, promising rest, promising to end her fear if she only let go. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood and held on. The Primarch raised, his hand over the weapon's core, his voice calm and steady. He told her that gods lived on the obedience of mortals, and mortals who refused obedience could break them. Then he activated the device. Light without color poured outward. The Archon. Ships shuddered. Their shimmering forms twisted and writhed, their thoughts unraveling. The unity that bound them shattered, and for the first time in centuries, Archons screamed. The fleets faltered, breaking apart, their assault on the sun collapsing into chaos. Mara shielded her eyes but could still feel the echo of their terror in her bones. The craft turned back, racing through the storm as enemy ships scattered in confusion. From Earth, Rourke saw the Archons falter. He rallied his fleet, striking, hard into the disarray. Terran ships burned bright, exile jaws tore through rivers of light, and together they drove the enemy back. The sun's fury stabilized, its surface no longer trembling under the pressure of divine will. The system lived. The battle had been won, but the cost was written in fire across every fleet. Countless ships lay broken, debris littered the orbits, and thousands of lives had been lost. As Mara returned to the flagship, shaken but alive, she knew the war was not finished. The Archons had been struck, but they were not yet destroyed. The Primarch looked upon the wreckage of battle and said only one thing. This is the beginning. Debts paid, futures chosen. The sun burned steady again, its fury no longer chained by the Archons, but the scars of the battle stretched across the system. Wreckage drifted in orbit, fragments of ships turning slowly in silence. Terran cruisers limped home with hulls torn and engines barely alive. Exile vessels moved among the debris like hunters circling a field of carrion, retrieving their own, finishing the wounded, silent in victory. Earth survived, yet no one felt like celebrating. Survival had been bought with blood, and with a debt that could never be ignored. Mara stood on the deck of the Primarch's flagship, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind still carrying the echo of the Archon's broken whispers. She had witnessed gods unravel, had heard their screams in silence, and though it gave her pride, it also filled her with unease. If gods could fall, what did that make those who struck them down? The Primarch appeared beside her, tall and calm, his armor black against the dim glow of the viewing windows. He did not look like a man basking in victory. He looked like a man measuring the next war. He told her the debt was now complete. The exiles had answered the call, had saved Earth and the system, and now humanity must fulfill its side. The archives would open. The pledge would be sworn. The greater war would begin. Back on Earth, the council gathered in the shattered war room. Screens flickered with broken signals, voices cracked with fatigue, but every delegate knew they had no choice. The Archons were not finished. Their fleet still burned beyond the stars. They would return and worse enemies might rise in their place. Rourke stood before them, his uniform torn, his voice strong. He told them that survival had never been free. He reminded them of the colonies built on barren rocks, of the oceans crossed with fragile ships, of every generation that had paid the cost of moving forward. He said the exiles were not saviors. They were kin forged in harsher fires, and though the price was steep, refusing it meant extinction. One by one, grudgingly, the council members agreed. The pledge would hold. Humanity would not stand alone. Mara returned to Earth and stood once more beneath a sky that looked almost peaceful. Children ran in the streets outside the shelters, laughing as if they had never seen the auroras of war. Parents wept quietly with relief, clutching them close. Farmers returned to their fields. Engineers repaired broken towers, and preachers spoke of survival as proof of destiny. Yet beneath the relief was a deeper awareness. The world had changed forever. No one could look at the stars without remembering that the exiles were out there, watching, waiting, and that one day humanity would march with them into battles beyond imagination. She met Rourke on the shoreline where waves beat gently against the sand. His face was older now, lined with weariness, but his eyes still carried the same fire. Together they watched the sky as exile ships moved silently across the horizon, dark silhouettes against the pale dawn. She asked him if he feared the price they had agreed to pay. He said fear did not matter, only choice, and humanity had chosen survival. He told her that in the long path of history, this moment would be remembered not as surrender, but as rebirth. The day when humans stood beside cousins, shaped by exile, and looked gods in the eye without kneeling. That night, Mara stood alone on the balcony of the tower. The city lights shimmered below, alive with quiet hope. Above her, the stars stretched endless and cold. Somewhere out there, the Archons licked their wounds, their pride broken but not their power. Somewhere beyond them, other forces stirred, waiting to test the galaxy. She thought of the Primarch's calm voice, of the exile warriors who fought without prayer, of the ships that tore gods apart, and she felt a strange certainty. Humanity had survived not because of mercy, but because of its own kin who had refused to bow, and now they too would learn that defiance. When the second sunrise came, the Primarch sent his final message to Earth. The debt was fulfilled. The war was only beginning, and the exiles would return when the call rose again. Until then, humanity would stand on its own, but not alone. Mara felt the words settle into her heart. The choice had been made, the future claimed, and though the path was dark, it was theirs. Rourke joined her on the balcony as the dawn spread across the ocean. They did not speak for a long time. They only watched the light climb higher, each of them knowing that the world would never again be the same. Mara whispered at last that even gods could bleed. Rourke answered that it was never gods who decided the future, only those who dared to choose. Together they stood in silence as the sun rose bright and unbroken over Earth. When gods trembled, the war in the system did not end with fire, but with silence. The Archons withdrew into the black beyond Jupiter, their rivers of light broken, their unity shattered. Earth was alive. Its sun burned steady, but the people knew life would never be the same. The streets filled with survivors who stepped out of shelters and saw the skies clear. Children pointed at the stars and laughed, but their parents held them close with the heavy knowledge of what had passed. They all understood that survival had been bought with the call that brought back the exiles. Mara walked the ruins of the Pacific Command Tower, the walls cracked from strain, the floors marked with ash. She looked out toward the ocean where ships carried the wounded back to shore and thought about the voices she had heard inside her skull when the Archons tried to break her mind. She remembered the device that silenced their thoughts, the way gods had screamed in terror, and the calm face of the Primarch as he stood unshaken. She knew humanity had crossed a threshold. They had once been prey to powers that called themselves divine, but now they had stood beside kin who feared nothing and learned that even gods could tremble. Rourke remained in orbit with what was left of the Terran fleet. His ships floated scarred and broken but not destroyed. He had lost many, too many, yet his voice across the channels remained firm. He told every survivor that their struggle mattered, that they had not fought in vain, that their sacrifice had carved a new chapter of history. His words spread through the network, reaching every colony and every home, and in them people found the strength to believe in tomorrow. The council met again in a chamber that smelled of smoke and iron. They argued as always, but this time their arguments no longer held the weight they once carried. The decision was made already in the fire of battle. Earth had pledged to the exiles. The archives would be opened. The bond would hold. Some leaders whispered of chains, others of freedom, but all knew the same truth. Humanity was no longer alone, and that path could not be undone. At dawn, Mara returned to the balcony where she had first seen the auroras of war. The sky was quiet now, soft with the rising sun, yet above her the exile fleet still lingered like silent sentinels. She knew they would leave soon, vanish into the darkness as suddenly as they had come, but the memory of their presence would remain. She closed her eyes and breathed the morning air, heavy with smoke yet alive with promise. For the first time she allowed herself to feel hope not only for survival but for strength. The Primarch sent one last message before his ships turned away. His voice echoed across the system, calm and unyielding. He said the debt was honored, and the war was not finished. He said the Archons would rise again, and beyond them lay greater storms. He said humanity had chosen to stand, and that choice mattered more than victory or defeat. Then the fleet vanished into the dark without farewell, leaving only silence in their wake. Mara stood with Rourke on the shoreline that evening. The waves rolled gentle against the sand, the air cool with night. They spoke little, for words were too small for what they had endured. They only watched the stars, each of them knowing that the galaxy had changed. Humanity had called and been answered. They had seen gods hesitate. They had paid their price and claimed their future. Mara whispered, softly, that even gods bleed. Rourke nodded and said it was never gods who chose the future, only mortals who refused to kneel. Above them the sky stretched endless and unbroken. The stars shone bright, no longer as distant threats, but as places yet to be reached. Earth was scarred but alive, and its people were ready to walk forward into the unknown, carrying the memory of the day when even gods trembled before the will of humankind. The end.